It began as a joke, at least to German tank crews. When the Allies rolled out their M4 Sherman tanks in the early years of the Second World War, many German commanders dismissed them as underpowered, thin-skinned, and hopelessly outmatched. Against the towering silhouettes of Tigers and Panthers, the Sherman seemed more like a mobile target than a serious threat. Its main gun could barely dent the frontal armor of German heavy tanks. Crews relied on mobility, numbers, and sheer determination to survive. But that perception would not last. By the summer of 1944, a new variant of the Sherman began appearing on the battlefield. This one carried a long-barreled British gun, an anti-tank weapon with the power to knock out a Tiger at range. German crews quickly learned to spot it, and just as quickly learned to fear it. The tank they once laughed at had changed. This is the story of how the Allies turned a mass-produced workhorse into a tank killer. How British engineers, working under pressure and with limited support, transformed the Sherman into the Firefly. In the late 1930s, Europe stood on the edge of another war, only 2 decades after the devastation of the First World War. Many nations had spent the interwar years rebuilding economies, managing political unrest, and clinging to diplomatic agreements that were often shaky at best. Germany, however, under Adolf Hitler's regime, had spent those same years rearming and rethinking the way wars would be fought. One of the most significant innovations Germany embraced was a new approach to warfare known as blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This was not a formal doctrine set in stone, but rather a set of tactics built around speed, coordination, and decisive force. At the center of it all were the tanks, armored vehicles that could move fast, strike hard, and exploit weakness. Tanks were not new, but Germany would use them in a way the world had never seen before. When German forces invaded Poland in September of 1939, the world got its first glimpse of blitzkrieg in action. German panzer divisions, working in close coordination with aircraft, infantry, and artillery, smashed through Polish defenses with alarming speed. The goal was not to slowly grind down the enemy, but to overwhelm them, fast, focused, and brutal. The tanks used in Poland were not the fearsome Tigers or Panthers that would come later. In fact, many of them were light tanks like the Panzer I and Panzer II, which were lightly armored and lightly armed. But what mattered was how they were used. German commanders like General Heinz Guderian emphasized mobility and communication. Radios were installed in every tank, allowing real-time coordination, an advantage many other nations lacked at the time. After the invasion of Poland, Germany turned west. In the spring of 1940, Hitler launched an offensive through the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and into France. This time, the panzers were joined by more capable models, like the Panzer III and Panzer IV. These tanks had better guns and armor, and their crews were gaining experience. The French and British, on the other hand, were still preparing for a war more like the one they had fought from 1914 to 1918. The French relied on the heavily armored but slow-moving Char B1 and spread their forces across a long defensive line known as the Maginot Line. The British Expeditionary Force brought Matilda tanks, which had strong armor but suffered from slow speed and limited coordination with infantry and air units. German forces bypassed much of the Maginot Line by advancing through the Ardennes Forest, a region the Allies had considered too dense for a major tank assault. It was a critical miscalculation. Once again, blitzkrieg proved devastating. Panzer divisions punched through the forest, crossed rivers, and drove deep into France. Within 6 weeks, the French government had collapsed, and German troops marched into Paris. One of the most astonishing elements of this campaign was how quickly it happened. From mid-May to late June of 1940, the German army had achieved what it had failed to do in 4 years during the First World War. The success was not simply due to superior tanks, though the Panzer IV was an effective design, but rather due to strategic innovation, speed, and the failure of Allied forces to adapt. German tank crews began to build reputations for effectiveness and bravery. These were often ordinary soldiers trained to operate in high-stress, fast-moving conditions. The psychological effect on their enemies was profound. Allied soldiers spoke of the speed with which German tanks appeared and how difficult it was to mount a coordinated defense. Entire divisions were cut off before they even knew they were under attack. After France's fall, Britain stood alone in Western Europe. German tanks never crossed the English Channel, but their presence loomed large. Photographs and newsreels showed panzer columns rolling through conquered territory. The image of the unstoppable German tank had taken root, not only in propaganda, but in the minds of generals and soldiers alike. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, Germany was preparing for an even larger operation. In June of 1941, Operation Barbarossa was launched, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest land invasion in history, involving millions of troops and thousands of tanks. German forces again led with panzer divisions, pushing deep into Soviet territory. The early months of the campaign followed a now familiar pattern: fast advances, encirclements, and heavy losses for the enemy. Soviet tank designs like the T-26 and BT series were outdated, and German crews found success despite the vastness of the Russian front. However, this campaign would stretch German resources and reveal the limits of blitzkrieg. Still, by the end of 1941, the myth of German tank superiority was firmly established. From Warsaw to Paris to Kiev, the sight of a panzer meant trouble. The German military had demonstrated that tanks were not just support weapons, they were central to modern warfare. This dominance did not go unnoticed by the Allies. British and American military planners began re-evaluating their own armored doctrines. The British began developing new tank designs, and in the United States, efforts were underway to create a new medium tank that could be produced quickly and in large numbers. That tank would eventually be known as the M4 Sherman. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the United States officially entered the Second World War. Within days, Germany and Italy had declared war on America, and a global conflict became truly worldwide. For the Axis powers, the American entry posed a serious long-term threat. But in the short term, there was skepticism. Many in the German high command believed the United States, lacking recent experience in modern warfare, would take years to pose any real challenge. In particular, American armored forces were viewed as underdeveloped and not without reason. At the time of America's entry into the war, the U.S. Army's tank fleet was still relatively small and largely outdated. Most of its tanks were light vehicles, like the M3 Stuart, suitable for reconnaissance and infantry support, but not intended to confront German armor directly. The United States had been preparing for possible conflict, but its military was still in transition, and its armored doctrine was heavily influenced by older First World War models. However, what the United States lacked in experience, it made up for in industrial capacity. American factories were not just larger, they were also more flexible, mechanized, and ready to shift toward war production on a massive scale. In Washington, military planners recognized that success in a global war would depend not only on tactics and technology, but on the ability to produce vast quantities of reliable equipment. As early as 1941, even before officially entering the war, the U.S. Army had already begun searching for a new medium tank that could serve as the backbone of its armored forces. The result was the M4 Sherman, a tank that would go on to become one of the most widely produced and widely used tanks of the Second World War. The Sherman was not designed to be the biggest or most heavily armed tank on the battlefield. Instead, it was engineered with a different set of priorities: reliability, ease of production, and mechanical simplicity. Its designers wanted a vehicle that could be maintained in the field, repaired quickly, and operated by large numbers of troops with minimal specialized training. It was a practical machine, one that reflected American industrial values more than battlefield supremacy. The first Sherman prototypes were completed in late 1941, and by early 1942, production was underway. The tank featured a 68mm main gun mounted in a fully rotating turret, a gasoline-powered engine, and armor that was respectable for the time, but not especially thick. It was faster and more mobile than many of its contemporaries, and it had a distinct rounded turret shape that would soon become iconic. American factories quickly adapted to the task. Plants that once built automobiles and farm equipment were converted to tank production. Companies like Ford, Chrysler, and American Locomotive began building Shermans in enormous numbers. Each vehicle was standardized, allowing for interchangeable parts and faster assembly. In a short span of time, the Sherman became a symbol of American industrial power, a tank that could be built faster than the Germans could destroy it. This mass production capability had immediate consequences. While German tanks like the Panzer IV and later the Tiger were technically superior in terms of armor and firepower, they were complex, expensive, and slow to build. A single Tiger might take months to complete. Meanwhile, American factories could turn out several dozen Shermans in the same time frame. But numbers alone do not win battles. What truly mattered was how these tanks would perform in combat. The first Shermans were sent overseas in mid-1942. Many of them were deployed to North Africa, where the United States had joined British forces in fighting the German Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. The harsh desert environment offered an early test of the Sherman's durability and effectiveness. Mechanically, the Sherman performed well. It handled desert terrain better than many British and German tanks, and its crew-friendly design allowed for easier maintenance in the field. The five-man crew benefited from good visibility and a relatively comfortable working environment compared to other tanks of the time. In terms of speed and mobility, the Sherman held its own. However, its armament was already starting to show limitations. The 68mm gun was effective against lighter German tanks and fortified positions, but it struggled against the improved Panzer IVs and had no reliable way to penetrate the frontal armor of the Tiger, which would appear later that year. In head-to-head tank duels, the Sherman was at a disadvantage. Despite this, the Sherman's real strength was not in a single engagement. It was in the system it supported. The U.S. Army's approach to warfare emphasized combined arms. Shermans operated alongside infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support. When used in coordinated formations, their shortcomings in armor and firepower could be mitigated. They were not superweapons. They were part of a much larger machine. American commanders were also encouraged by the tank's ability to reach the battlefield in large numbers. In an environment where equipment attrition was high, having a reliable tank that could be replaced quickly was a major strategic advantage. As one U.S. officer reportedly said, "Quantity has a quality all its own." British forces, too, received Shermans through the Lend-Lease program. By the end of 1942, the Sherman was being used by several Allied armies, including Canada and Free French forces. It was rapidly becoming the most common Allied tank in the war. Back in Germany, however, the reaction was largely dismissive. German commanders who encountered the Sherman in Africa or the Eastern Front generally considered it inferior to their own tanks. Its gun was seen as weak, its armor as thin, and its high profile made it easier to spot and target. In tank versus tank combat, German gunners typically held the upper hand. Yet few German officers fully appreciated what was happening behind the scenes. They saw the Sherman as a symbol of Allied inferiority. What they failed to understand was that the Sherman's success was not about being better in one-on-one duels. It was about enabling the Allies to project armored power across vast distances, resupply quickly, and maintain momentum in prolonged campaigns. Even so, concerns about the Sherman's weaknesses were not ignored by Allied planners. By the end of 1942, both British and American officers were aware that improvements would be needed, especially when facing newer German tanks with thicker armor and more powerful guns. Discussions had already begun on how to upgrade the Sherman or develop companion vehicles capable of handling heavier threats. But in the meantime, production continued at an unprecedented pace. By the close of 1942, thousands of Shermans had rolled off assembly lines and into combat zones. In every theater where the Allies were active, North Africa, the Pacific, and Europe, the Sherman was becoming a familiar sight. This tank would not be the final word in armored warfare. Its limitations were real, and they would become more apparent as the war went on. But in these early stages, the Sherman represented a new kind of power, not measured in inches of armor or caliber of gun, but in scale, logistics, and coordination. By early 1942, the Sherman tank was no longer just a product of American assembly lines. It was now in the field, in the hands of Allied crews, and rolling into real combat. Its first major theater of war was North Africa, a region that had already seen 2 years of armored warfare between British and German forces. For the Sherman, North Africa would become a proving ground, a place where its strengths and weaknesses were laid bare in harsh desert conditions and under fire from some of the most experienced German tank crews in the war. The North African campaign began as a struggle between Britain and Germany, with Italian forces as Germany's unreliable partner. In early 1941, Adolf Hitler had sent General Erwin Rommel to bolster Italian defenses in Libya after repeated British victories. Rommel quickly turned the situation around. Commanding the newly formed Africa Corps, he launched a series of bold offensives that pushed British forces back across the desert. His ability to move quickly, strike unexpectedly, and exploit weaknesses earned him the nickname the Desert Fox. By the time American troops joined the fight in late 1942, Rommel had already built a reputation as one of the most capable commanders of the war. The Americans, meanwhile, were new to desert warfare and new to modern armored combat. Their arrival in Operation Torch marked the beginning of large-scale Anglo-American cooperation in Africa, and the beginning of a steep learning curve. The Sherman tank first saw significant combat in Tunisia, where U.S. forces encountered the Africa Corps head-on. These battles were far from theoretical. Tank crews had to contend not only with enemy fire, but with the blistering heat, choking dust, and mechanical strain caused by desert terrain. Vehicles overheated, tracks wore out quickly, and sand clogged engines and gears. In these conditions, the Sherman's mechanical reliability proved to be a valuable asset. Unlike earlier British tanks, which often suffered from maintenance issues and short operational lifespans in desert conditions, the Sherman held up well. Its engine was robust, its suspension system coped reasonably well with the rough landscape, and it had a relatively low breakdown rate. Crews found that they could trust the Sherman to keep moving, an essential quality in a war of maneuver across vast open spaces. In terms of performance against German armor, however, the Sherman's debut was mixed. Early confrontations, such as the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February of 1943, highlighted the challenges American forces faced. At Kasserine, inexperienced U.S. commanders and Green troops were caught off guard by a coordinated German assault. The result was a costly defeat. German tanks and anti-tank guns inflicted heavy losses on U.S. units, and Shermans were knocked out in significant numbers. Much of this was not the fault of the tank itself, but of tactics, organization, and experience. American crews often advanced without proper reconnaissance or coordination with supporting units. German forces made excellent use of ambush positions, camouflage, and terrain. They placed their anti-tank guns in well-concealed locations and used their own armor sparingly but effectively. The Sherman's relatively high profile made it easier to spot, and its 68mm guns struggled to penetrate the frontal armor of the upgraded Panzer IVs. However, the Americans adapted quickly. After Kasserine, command structures were reorganized and new leadership was installed. General George S. Patton took command of U.S. forces in North Africa, bringing with him a sense of discipline, urgency, and aggressive spirit. Under Patton, tank tactics improved, coordination between infantry and armor became more effective, and morale increased. The Sherman, which had taken heavy losses, now had a better chance to demonstrate what it could do in a well-organized system. By the time of the Battle of El Guetar in March of 1943, American forces were operating more effectively. Shermans were now used in larger formations, supported by artillery and airstrikes. In this engagement, U.S. tank units repelled a German armored assault, destroying dozens of vehicles and proving that under the right conditions, they could stand up to the Afrika Korps. British tank units, who had been fighting in North Africa since the beginning of the campaign, also began to receive Shermans through the Lend-Lease program. British crews appreciated the Sherman's mechanical reliability and ease of use, especially compared to older British designs like the Crusader or the Valentine. While still critical of the Sherman's firepower, they made good use of it in combined arms tactics, particularly during the Second Battle of El Alamein. At El Alamein, British and Commonwealth forces under General Bernard Montgomery launched a massive offensive against German and Italian positions. The Sherman played a supporting role, helping to break through minefields and entrenched defenses. Although much of the heavy lifting was done by artillery and infantry, tanks were essential in exploiting breaches in the enemy line. The battle marked a turning point in the North African campaign. After El Alamein, Rommel's forces began a slow retreat westward, pursued by Allied armies across Libya and into Tunisia. By the spring of 1943, the Axis presence in North Africa was collapsing. With British forces advancing from the east and American troops pushing from the west, German and Italian units found themselves trapped. In May, over 200,000 Axis troops surrendered in Tunisia. North Africa was now under Allied control. For the Sherman, the North African campaign had been a trial by fire. It had performed well in many respects: mobility, reliability, crew survivability. But its limitations were now clear. The 68mm gun was rapidly becoming inadequate against newer German tanks, especially when facing them frontally. German tank crews began to understand that while Shermans could be deadly when flanking or in numbers, they could still be destroyed if engaged at range or from prepared positions. Sherman crews also learned hard lessons. Many tankers discovered that frontal assaults against prepared anti-tank defenses were deadly. Survivability often came down to who saw whom first and who fired first. The Sherman's relatively thin armor meant that even a single hit from a German anti-tank round could disable or destroy the vehicle. As a result, American and British tactics increasingly emphasized maneuver, flanking, and support from infantry and artillery. Another important lesson was the psychological impact of tank warfare. Crew members had to operate in confined, hot, and dangerous conditions. When a Sherman was hit, escape was often a matter of seconds. Fires could spread rapidly, and ammunition could ignite catastrophically. Despite these dangers, many crews developed strong bonds and a sense of duty that kept them fighting. As one British tanker remarked after a battle in Tunisia, "The tank might not be perfect, but it's ours, and we make it work." By the end of the North African campaign, the Sherman had proven itself to be a valuable, if imperfect, asset. It was not the best tank on the battlefield, but it was good enough to get the job done. And, crucially, It could be produced and maintained in the numbers required to sustain offensive operations. In the summer of 1943, a new tank rolled onto the battlefield, a machine that would redefine armored warfare and send a ripple of anxiety through Allied commands. It was not just another upgraded Panzer or an incremental improvement. It was a leap in firepower and protection, and it changed the dynamics of every engagement where it appeared. Its name was the Tiger. Officially designated as the Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger Ausführung I, or Tiger WWII, this German heavy tank was designed to dominate. It weighed over 50 metric tons, was protected by armor up to 120 millimeters thick in places, and mounted a long-barreled 88mm KWK-36 gun. Originally developed as an anti-aircraft weapon, the 88 had proven devastating against tanks. Now, it was installed on a vehicle that could absorb tremendous punishment and deliver fatal shots from long distances. The Tiger was not the result of battlefield improvisation. It was the product of deliberate planning. German High Command recognized that Soviet tanks like the T-34 had forced a rethink on the Eastern Front. The T-34's sloped armor, speed, and relatively powerful gun had shocked German tank crews when Operation Barbarossa began in 1941. Though Germany adapted quickly with improved versions of the Panzer IV, it was clear that something more powerful would be needed to regain battlefield superiority. The answer was the Tiger. Its debut in the Soviet Union was tentative at first. Early models saw action near Leningrad in late 1942, but mechanical issues and challenging terrain limited their impact. It was not until mid-1943, during the Battle of Kursk, that the Tiger made its presence fully felt. There, on the vast open steppes of Western Russia, German forces launched a massive offensive aimed at cutting off a large Soviet salient. Over 2 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and tens of thousands of aircraft clashed in what would become the largest tank battle in history. German units fielded over 700 Tigers and Panthers, another newly introduced medium tank, against entrenched Soviet positions. Though the offensive ultimately failed, the performance of the Tiger impressed friend and foe alike. Soviet crews quickly learned to fear its 88mm gun, which could destroy most Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. It was not long before the Tiger appeared in the West. By the time Allied planners were preparing for the invasion of Italy, reports of the Tiger's capabilities were being taken seriously. British and American intelligence officers studied field reports, examined wrecked Tigers when possible, and tried to assess just how big of a threat this new tank posed. Their conclusions were sobering. The Sherman, still the primary Allied medium tank, could not reliably penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor under normal combat conditions. Even side and rear shots often required close range or specialized ammunition. When Tigers were deployed in Tunisia in early 1943, they made an immediate impression. In one notable engagement near the town of Sidi Bouzid, a handful of Tigers supported by infantry and anti-tank guns decimated an American armored force that had advanced without adequate reconnaissance. Sherman rounds bounced harmlessly off the Tiger's thick frontal armor, while return fire from the 88mm gun destroyed Shermans with single shots. These encounters revealed a growing imbalance in tank-to-tank confrontations. The Sherman had performed well against earlier German designs like the Panzer III and Panzer IV, but it was simply not designed to face a vehicle like the Tiger. The Sherman's 68mm gun, which had been considered adequate just a year earlier, was now clearly underpowered. To make matters worse, German crews operating the Tiger were often elite units, trained and disciplined, with a high level of tactical awareness. In the hands of experienced commanders, a small number of Tigers could hold off much larger Allied formations, especially in defensive positions. One such example was at the Battle of Villers-Bocage in France, where a single Tiger commanded by Michael Whitman ambushed a British armored column, destroying multiple vehicles in minutes and halting the advance. The psychological impact of the Tiger was almost as powerful as its gun. Sherman crews began referring to their own tanks as Ronsons, a brand of cigarette lighter, joking grimly that they lit up the first time. Though this nickname was based more on fear than data, studies later showed the Sherman was no more flammable than other tanks. The perception was widespread. The tall profile of the Sherman, combined with its lighter armor, made it an easy target for the long-range guns of the Tiger and the emerging Panther. Allied planners faced a dilemma. Replacing the Sherman entirely would take time the war effort could not afford. Designing a new heavy tank would delay production and risk disrupting the logistical systems that had been carefully built around the Sherman standardization. The solution, at least in the short term, would have to be an upgrade, something that could boost the Sherman's firepower without requiring an entirely new vehicle. The British, in particular, recognized this need early. They had already been working on the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a high-velocity weapon capable of penetrating thick armor at long range. However, mounting such a gun on a Sherman presented serious challenges. The recoil was significant, the breech was large, and space inside the turret was limited. Initial proposals were met with skepticism from American authorities, who were reluctant to alter a system that was already in mass production. Still, British engineers persisted. In workshops across southern England, experiments were conducted using existing Sherman hulls. Turrets were modified, recoil systems adapted, and internal space was reconfigured to make room for the 17-pounder and its long barrel. The result was a new variant of the Sherman, one that would come to be known as the Firefly. Before the Firefly could be deployed in large numbers, however, Allied forces had to deal with the growing presence of the Tiger and its companion, the Panther. The Panther was technically a medium tank, but its sloped armor and powerful 75mm high-velocity gun gave it many of the same advantages as the Tiger. It was lighter and faster, and soon became the standard German response to the Sherman. By late 1943, the balance in tank warfare was tipping again. The Allies held superiority in numbers, logistics, and air power. But on the ground, in direct tank battles, the German designs were proving hard to match. Even though Tigers and Panthers were often plagued by mechanical issues and fuel shortages, their ability to destroy Allied tanks at range meant that every engagement came at a high cost. Tank crews adapted. American and British units increasingly relied on combined arms tactics, calling in artillery, aircraft, or infantry support to suppress or destroy German armor. They learned to flank, to use terrain, and to coordinate movements. Still, these were workarounds, not solutions. The question remained: how could the Allies defeat German heavy armor with what they had? By the end of 1943, the situation on the battlefield had made one fact impossible to ignore. The standard Sherman tank, while reliable and numerous, could no longer hold its own against the growing might of German armored forces. The emergence of the Tiger and Panther tanks had exposed the Sherman's greatest vulnerability: its lack of penetrating firepower. German heavy armor could destroy a Sherman at long range, often before the Sherman could even respond effectively. While American planners hesitated to deviate from their production strategy, the British approached the problem with a sense of urgency. The solution, in their view, was not to scrap the Sherman, but to adapt it. That solution came in the form of one of the most famous tank conversions of the war, the Sherman Firefly. The idea behind the Firefly was straightforward in theory, but complex in execution. British engineers proposed modifying the Sherman to carry their powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a weapon capable of penetrating the frontal armor of both the Tiger and the Panther. This gun had already shown promise in towed form, but fitting it into the compact turret of a Sherman would require ingenuity and determination. Much of the early experimentation took place at Lulworth and other testing facilities in southern England. One of the key figures in this effort was Major George Brighty, a British officer and engineer who became instrumental in the Firefly project. Along with other designers and technicians, Brighty tackled the technical obstacles one by one. The first major challenge was the size of the 17-pounder itself. The gun's breech was large, and its recoil was significantly more powerful than that of the Sherman's original 68mm cannon. Installing the gun required modifying the turret to accommodate the longer recoil distance. This meant repositioning the radio, relocating the gunner's seat, and reinforcing parts of the turret structure to manage the new stresses. Another issue was ammunition. The 17-pounder shells were larger and heavier, which reduced the amount that could be stored inside the tank. Nonetheless, British engineers created a workable arrangement that allowed for sufficient rounds to be carried into combat. The result was a unique and effective blend of American engineering and British firepower. The project was not without resistance. Some British commanders doubted the practicality of modifying the Sherman. Others worried about disrupting logistics or introducing a weapon that might require special maintenance and training. From the American side, there was even greater skepticism. U.S. officials had committed to the idea of producing as many standard Shermans as possible, believing that quantity, speed, and combined arms tactics would overcome any single disadvantage in armor or firepower. However, British field commanders saw the matter differently. With the planned invasion of Western Europe on the horizon, they needed a weapon that could stop a Tiger in its tracks. Too many Allied tank crews had already paid the price for facing German heavy armor without a fighting chance. The British government, recognizing the need to prepare for the Normandy campaign, authorized full production of the modified Sherman. The tank was given the nickname Firefly, a nod to the bright muzzle flash produced by the 17-pounder's high-velocity rounds. By early 1944, Fireflies were entering production in greater numbers. British workshops, often using existing Sherman hulls provided through Lend-Lease, began churning out converted vehicles at a steady pace. Unlike many other tank projects of the war, the Firefly was not the result of a government directive or a top-down decision. It was a grassroots innovation, born from necessity and driven by the practical knowledge of engineers and soldiers alike. As British and Canadian armored units prepared for Operation Overlord, the Firefly became a highly anticipated addition to their arsenal. The Firefly retained most of the standard Sherman's design, including its 5-man crew and general layout. But its firepower was a game-changer. In combat trials, the 17-pounder was able to penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor at over 1,500 meters, a feat nearly impossible for the standard Sherman. Even more important, it gave Allied crews the confidence that they could engage German heavy tanks on more equal terms. Despite the added weight of the gun and its ammunition, the Firefly maintained the Sherman's mobility and reliability. This balance of traits made it ideal for supporting infantry, leading armored advances, or lying in wait as an ambush weapon. Its long barrel, however, created a new challenge. It made the Firefly more conspicuous. German crews soon learned to identify the vehicle by the length of its gun and often prioritized Fireflies as primary targets. To counter this, some units took to camouflage. Crews painted disruptive patterns on the barrel or mounted canvas wraps to make the gun appear shorter at a distance. These field modifications helped hide the Firefly's identity during movement and ambushes. The very fact that German tank commanders feared it so much was a testament to its effectiveness. The British Army began assigning Fireflies at a ratio of 1 per troop, meaning 1 Firefly for every 3 or 4 standard Shermans. This allowed each unit to field a tank capable of dealing with the heaviest German armor, while retaining the logistical simplicity and maneuverability of the broader Sherman fleet. Canadian units adopted similar ratios, and Fireflies also began appearing in Polish, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth formations. As D-Day approached, Fireflies were distributed among the forces preparing to land in Normandy. By June of 1944, several hundred Fireflies were ready for combat. While not yet present in overwhelming numbers, they were in place where they mattered most, among the spearhead units that would face German armored counterattacks in the days and weeks after the landings. The arrival of the Firefly was not just a tactical development, it was a psychological shift. For too long, Allied tank crews had faced the grim reality of encountering a Tiger with little more than hope and maneuver. Now, with the 17-pounder in the field, they had a tool that could kill a Tiger before it could close the distance. Importantly, the Firefly did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader Allied effort to adapt, innovate, and prepare for the massive challenge of retaking Western Europe. The Sherman, in all its forms, would remain the workhorse of Allied armored forces. But the Firefly was its sharp edge, a critical upgrade made possible by cooperation between nations and the determination of engineers who refused to accept the status quo. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in history. Operation Overlord, the assault on Nazi-occupied France, marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Third Reich. Among the British and Commonwealth units storming the beaches and pushing inland were tank crews equipped with a new and formidable tool, the Sherman Firefly. Although the Firefly had not been produced in overwhelming numbers, its presence was carefully distributed. British and Canadian armored regiments made sure each troop had at least one Firefly to support standard Shermans. That meant when German tanks counterattacked, as they were expected to do, Allied forces would not be entirely reliant on artillery or air support to fight back. The terrain of Normandy was not favorable for armored warfare. Unlike the open deserts of North Africa or the broad plains of Eastern Europe, the countryside of northern France was broken into narrow roads, dense hedgerows, and enclosed fields known as bocage. These natural barriers made visibility poor and created countless opportunities for ambush. In this environment, the Firefly's long barrel made it hard to hide, but its powerful 17-pounder made it deadly in defensive positions. One of the earliest and most famous uses of the Firefly occurred during the Battle of Villers-Bocage on June 13th, just 1 week after D-Day. In that engagement, a German Tiger tank commanded by Michael Wittmann ambushed a British armored column, destroying more than a dozen vehicles. Although Wittmann's bold strike initially went unchallenged, British reinforcements, including Firefly-equipped units, eventually arrived and pushed the Germans back. While the exact tank that knocked out Wittmann's Tiger remains debated, what matters is that Fireflies were instrumental in restoring British momentum during that phase of the battle. More importantly, the Germans began to take notice. By midsummer of 1944, German tank crews had learned to identify the Firefly by its distinctive long barrel. Orders circulated among panzer units. If you see a Sherman with a long gun, take it out first. The Firefly had earned a place of priority on the battlefield, not because of its armor or speed, but because it could kill a Tiger. British tankers also knew their weapon's value. They often employed the Firefly in ambush roles, placing it in concealed positions where it could wait for a German tank to present a side or rear profile. Given that the Tigers and Panthers were most vulnerable from these angles, Firefly crews practiced patience, coordination, and timing. In many engagements, the Firefly acted as the sniper of the armored unit, while standard Shermans provided mobility and support. One such example took place near Saint-Aignan-de-Cramesnil in August of 1944. During a Canadian operation south of Caen, a Firefly from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment engaged and destroyed several German tanks in rapid succession, including the Tiger II, or King Tiger, commanded by Michael Wittmann. This time, there was little doubt. The Firefly had fired the fatal shot. The destruction of one of Germany's most celebrated tank aces sent a strong message. Allied tanks, once dismissed, were no longer to be taken lightly. As the Allies pushed eastward through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Fireflies continued to play a vital role in combating German armor. In city streets, narrow roads, and wooded terrain, they supported infantry advances and repelled counterattacks. Although they still operated alongside standard Shermans, their presence added a layer of confidence to Allied formations. The Firefly was not without limitations. The long 17-pounder barrel could be cumbersome in close quarters. The interior space remained cramped, especially with the larger ammunition. Reloading under fire required both skill and speed. And like all Shermans, the Firefly remained vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons, especially the dreaded Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck, which German infantry used with devastating effect in urban combat. Nevertheless, the balance had shifted. The Sherman's earlier nickname, the Tommy Cooker, used by German crews to mock its flammability, was now being replaced by real concern. A Sherman that could destroy a Tiger from more than 1,000 meters was no longer a joke. It was a serious threat. German tactical doctrine began to reflect this new reality. Fireflies were no longer ignored. They were hunted. One factor that amplified the Firefly's impact was the state of the German armored forces in the final years of the war. Although Tigers and Panthers were technically superior on paper, their production numbers were low and their mechanical reliability often poor. A single Tiger could take far longer to build than several Shermans. Spare parts were limited. Fuel shortages plagued German formations, and experienced crews were becoming harder to replace. This meant that each engagement carried more weight for the Germans. Losing a Tiger was not just a tactical blow, it was a strategic one. Fireflies, though fewer in number than standard Shermans, made these losses more likely. By late 1944, as the Allies approached the German border, the Firefly had become a standard part of the British armored doctrine. Canadian and Polish units also used the Firefly extensively, and reports from the front consistently highlighted its effectiveness. During Operation Market Garden in September, Fireflies supported airborne troops and engaged German tanks near Arnhem and Nijmegen, again proving their value in both offensive and defensive roles. As the Allies crossed into Germany in early 1945, tank battles became less frequent, but no less dangerous. German ambushes, last-ditch offensives, and entrenched resistance made every mile a challenge. Fireflies continued to provide the firepower necessary to overcome these obstacles. Importantly, the Firefly's success was not simply a result of its weaponry, it was the result of its integration into a broader system. Allied forces had improved their coordination between armor, infantry, artillery, and air power. The Firefly gave tank crews a fighting chance, but it was the cooperation between branches that delivered victory. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, the Sherman Firefly stood as a symbol of adaptation and innovation. It had taken a design that once struggled against German armor and transformed it into a battlefield equalizer. Though it never matched the Tiger or Panther in armor thickness, it did not need to. It brought balance to the battlefield and gave Allied crews the ability to fight back with confidence. As the guns of Europe finally fell silent in May of 1945, the world began to take stock of the war's unprecedented scale, destruction, and transformation. For the Allied nations, victory had come through a combination of manpower, logistics, technology, and cooperation. Among the many tools that had shaped this outcome, the Sherman Firefly stood out, not simply for its battlefield impact, but for what it represented: innovation under pressure and the power of adaptation. With the war over, many Fireflies continued to serve in Allied forces for a time. In the immediate post-war years, both Britain and several Commonwealth nations retained Fireflies as part of their armored units. The cost of developing new tank fleets was high, and the Firefly had proven itself as a reliable platform with serious firepower. Some continued service into the early 1950s before being phased out in favor of more modern designs like the Centurion. Yet while the tank's military role began to fade, its reputation was just beginning to crystallize in the public imagination. Soldiers who had fought in Normandy, the Low Countries, and Germany shared their stories, often speaking with a mix of respect and relief when it came to the Firefly. For many tank crews, the Firefly had been more than a machine. It had been a lifeline. The 17-pounder gave them the means to strike back against enemies that had once seemed unstoppable. As historians and military analysts began to document the war in greater detail, the Firefly's legacy was examined with increasing interest. Some early accounts elevated it to near-mythical status, portraying it as the ultimate Sherman variant and the weapon that had finally neutralized the fearsome Tiger. In popular literature and television documentaries, the Firefly was often framed as the unsung hero of armored warfare in Western Europe. There was truth in this view, but also exaggeration. The Firefly was never a flawless tank. Its armor was still relatively light compared to its German counterparts. Its silhouette remained tall and easy to spot. And although its 17-pounder could destroy a Tiger or Panther, it still required favorable conditions. Good positioning, clear sightlines, and often the element of surprise. Firefly crews had to be smart, cautious, and precise. They were not invincible, and neither was their tank. What set the Firefly apart was not its perfection, but its purpose. It filled a gap in Allied capabilities at a time when no other fielded tank could effectively counter the newest German armor in a one-on-one engagement. And unlike many experimental or late-war designs, it did so in time to matter. From Normandy to the Rhine, the Firefly had a direct and measurable impact on combat operations. Post-war evaluations by military institutions in Britain and beyond reflected a growing appreciation for the tank's role in the broader strategic picture. Its existence allowed for more aggressive tactics and greater confidence in offensive maneuvers. Units that might have hesitated to engage in open terrain against a known German tank position could now do so with a fighting chance. This shift in morale, while difficult to quantify, was frequently noted in after-action reports and oral histories. The Firefly's design also influenced post-war tank development in indirect ways. While it was itself a stopgap solution, its success demonstrated the value of combining proven platforms with powerful armament upgrades. Later tanks, such as the Centurion and the American M4 Patton, embraced the idea that mobility and firepower could and should exist together without excessive trade-offs in protection or maintainability. However, not all narratives around the Firefly remained consistent. Over time, some post-war discussions tended to romanticize the tank while glossing over the contributions of other systems. The Firefly was never the only answer to German armor. Allied air superiority, superior logistics, and artillery firepower played enormous roles in blunting German counterattacks and limiting the movement of heavy tank units. In many cases, it was not a Firefly that destroyed a Tiger, but a rocket-firing Typhoon aircraft or a well-placed anti-tank gun. Even so, the Firefly's psychological value was real and significant. German records confirm that crews were trained to recognize and prioritize Fireflies on the battlefield. The fact that a modified Sherman was now among the most feared tanks in Western Europe was a powerful reversal of fortunes from the early days of the war. Survivors of both sides carried these memories into the post-war decades. For British and Commonwealth crews, the Firefly became a point of pride, proof that Allied innovation could match and, in some cases, overcome German engineering. For German veterans, it served as a reminder that numerical superiority was no longer the Allies' only advantage. Today, surviving Fireflies are preserved in museums and military collections across Europe and North America. Restored vehicles can be found in places like the Bovington Tank Museum in Britain and the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. They stand as both historical artifacts and tributes to the ingenuity of those who built, modified, and fought in them. Military historians continue to debate certain aspects of the Firefly's legacy. How many Tigers did it actually destroy? Was it the best Allied tank of the war, or merely the best available compromise? These questions, while important, often miss the larger point. The Firefly was never designed to win the war on its own. It was designed to solve a problem, and it did. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Firefly lies in the lesson it offers about wartime innovation. Faced with a superior enemy weapon, the British did not wait for a perfect solution. They worked with what they had, combined resources with their allies, and pushed through institutional resistance to create something effective. That mindset, focused, collaborative, and pragmatic, was a key reason the Allies were able to turn the tide in Europe. The story of the Firefly also challenges the notion that technological superiority alone determines victory. German tanks like the Tiger and Panther were remarkable machines, but their limited numbers, high maintenance demands, and production delays hindered their impact. The Firefly, by contrast, exemplified balance, good enough firepower, reliable mechanics, and a place in a larger, more flexible fighting force. As decades have passed, the laughter that once greeted the Sherman has faded. In its place is a respect earned not through flash or dominance, but through persistence and adaptation. The Firefly was the moment the Allies answered back, not with a brand new tank, but with a clever, timely reimagining of what they already had. That response changed the battlefield. And it changed the way German tank crews looked at the Sherman. Not as a target, but as a threat